I wanted to wish you a good afternoon, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this other major LISD endeavor on the issue of role of trafficking, the role of states and actors in that which I consider pretty horrendous endeavor, and in this case, in specific dimensions, the role of the United States Department of State to deal with this issue. And we are delighted to have President Obama's special envoy for that issue with us, and I'm delighted to give the floor to, I want to say ambassador English.
I'll take it, okay.
Yeah. But I'm particularly also delighted that this endeavor, which, as you all know, she has launched within the Liechtenstein Institute since 2010, has really taken on this dynamic, and I'm very pleased that you could come to us, to Princeton here, and I hope that won't be the last one, and we could actually then really sort of institutionalize this cooperation. With this, Dr.
Yes,
English,
thank
the floor
you.
is yours.
I apologize for our tardiness, and I'll very quickly just introduce our speaker for this afternoon. It's our great pleasure to have Ambassador CdeBaca with us. And he was appointed by President Obama in May of 2009 to coordinate U.S. government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery. And currently he's serving as the senior advisor to the Secretary of State and directs the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And the TIP office does a number of very important things, assesses global trends related to trafficking. It issues annually a trafficking in persons report, provides technical training, technical assistance and training. It engages governments around the world, and by its definition, advocates for an end to modern slavery. The ambassador formerly served as counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary, where his portfolio for Chairman John Conyers Jr. included national security, intelligence, immigration, civil rights, and modern slavery issues. He has a very long and distinguished career at the Justice Department. He was one of the country's most decorated federal prosecutors, leading the investigation and prosecution of cases involving a number of issues: money laundering, organized crime, alien smuggling, official misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. He has convicted dozens of abusive pimps and employers, and helped to liberate hundreds of victims of servitude. He was honored with the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for his service as lead trial counsel in the then largest slavery prosecution in U.S. history, which involved the enslavement of over 300 Chinese and Vietnamese workers in a garment factory in American Samoa. He has additionally received the department's highest litigation honor, the Attorney General's John Marshall Award, and and the Director's Award from the Executive Office of United States Attorneys. He has received the leading honor given by the National Trafficking Victim Service Provider Community, the Freedom Network's Paul and Sheila Wellstone Award, and has been named a Michigan Law School Distinguished Latino Alumnus. The ambassador received his law degree from Michigan Law School, where he was editor of the Michigan Law Review. So please help me welcoming Ambassador CdeBaca.
Thank you, Beth, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Dr. Dansma-Gruber. This is, for me, a very good opportunity to come up to a place where thought is being led, not just within the academy, but also out in the field and out in the world. And I think that this notion of the academy in action, the notion of diplomats not simply being the folks who are accredited by their government, but diplomats being the people who are engaging in solving problems, is, I think, the future of not only of foreign policy, but I think in many ways the future of the academy as well, is this idea taking these ideas and putting them in practice. It gives me a lot of optimism when I see such enthusiasm on a campus, whether it's in classrooms that are packed with students who want to take a course on human trafficking, whether it's activism that you see out on the campus, whether in clubs or otherwise. And it gives me optimism because a dozen years ago, this just would not have happened. The promulgation of the United Nations protocol, what we call the Palermo Protocol, against trafficking in persons in the year 2000, this just wasn't something that governments would recognize, certainly something that governments even wanted to acknowledge. But also the advocacy community, the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy think tanks, the policy schools themselves didn't even recognize as existing, much less a topic of study or a topic to be brought into the curriculum. It was there, and it was dealt with in many ways, but it was touched on as part of other things, whether labor studies, whether women's studies, whether it was something that was most often perhaps dealt with in the history curriculum. Because of course, this is where one should look at it, because of course, slavery no longer exists. We took care of that problem. Well, 150 years ago, yes, 150 years ago this fall, President Lincoln issued an executive order, went into effect 150 years ago on January 1st, this coming year, saying that slavery was illegal. And a few years after that, we passed a constitutional amendment saying that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude should exist. And those were events. But none of those ended slavery. They certainly withdrew the state approval of slavery. They certainly said that slavery was a crime and that slavery should be abolished. But slavery didn't end that day. And the promise that President Lincoln made 150 years ago this September was not a one-time event. It was a promise that binds us today. Because just as slavery continues into the modern era, so does our collective responsibility to address it. And we have new tools, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those new tools today. But those new tools very much come from this UN protocol that I mentioned, the Palermo Protocol. In the 12 years since Palermo was enacted, and we updated our own post-Civil War anti-slavery laws here in the United States, the fight against modern slavery has trickled down from the multilateral fora, like the UN, the halls of government at the national level, like the Capitol, into our state houses and city halls, and even police precincts. From an enforcement standpoint, that's great news. Fighting crime at the local level is essential, and the fact that most states have gotten on board and committed to keep doing what we now know works is very much a step in the right direction. But seeing the anti-trafficking movement reborn over and over on college campuses across the country tells me that we're really picking up speed. When a crop of future lawyers say, we want a class on human trafficking law, the law schools have to respond. And we've seen that at NYU, at Michigan, Georgetown, Catholic, etc. When policy students are building their theses and their dissertations on the way that international standards are evolving, when kids in the dorms start looking at the way that their consumer habits feed the demand for human trafficking and demand corporate accountability, I don't just see where the movement is today, I see where this movement is being taken. With a crime that victimizes up to 27 million people around the world, we're not talking about an overnight solution. We're looking for a generational transformation. And I think that that's one of the reasons why doing some work on, not just in the policy schools, not just in the graduate schools, but at the undergraduate level is critically important. because it's that generation that's going to be delivering on this 150-year-old promise of freedom. The generations that have gone before us, too many times in the 150 years since President Lincoln issued that challenge to all of us, too many times generations have turned their back and said, slavery is a thing of the past. And then another group of workers are brought in, indentured with debt bondage. More women are beaten by pimps who don't want to let them go. More sweatshops happen. And the same farms, the exact same farms, with the same crops that were picked by people who were legally owned 150 years ago, are picked by people who are in debt bondage 150 years later. Maybe the Spanish, as opposed to the English being spoken. Maybe the people are a little darker and a little shorter, a little more Indian looking. But at the same time, a very similar economy built on exploitation. So this notion of how we break that cycle, how do we break the cycle of exploitation? How do we break this dependence upon slave-made goods, slave-provide services, a sex industry fueled by trafficking, whether in the United States or at home, is going to take a generational shift. Because it's not just moving towards better enforcement of anti-trafficking laws, though that's important. It's moving toward a rejection of the economic underpinnings of human trafficking. But to do that, to have that generational shift, we have to understand what it is that we're even talking about. Now, if there's one thing that the Palermo Protocol, in full disclosure, I worked on negotiating the Palermo Protocol during the Clinton administration. And for those of you who are taking notes, it is actually the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, which is a supplementary protocol to the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. You can say that, or you can just say Palermo Protocol. So I'm just going to say Palermo Protocol. The Palermo Protocol did some wonderful things. It brought in this notion of prevention, protection, and prosecution, an interwoven responsibility, what we call the 3P approach. The notion that you can't simply prosecute the traffickers and not have programs to rehabilitate and restore the victims. The notion that you can't simply have awareness-raising campaigns if they're not going to drive people towards apprehending the traffickers and bringing them to justice. The notion that you can't have an underground railroad type of system that is only non-governmental organizations providing shelter to trafficking victims, only the nuns in some countries that are working on this, if you don't also have structural prevention mechanisms, interlocking 3P paradigm. And that 3P paradigm is a great thing. And the fact that the Palermo Protocol, for the first time, held governments responsible for making it illegal to hold someone as a slave within their own borders, as opposed to simply focusing upon the transnational movement of the people to be enslaved, was a huge breakthrough. It breaks the logjam put in place by the newly ascendant Japan in 1904, fresh from their win over Russia, who blocked an early attempt to address this because they didn't want to abolish the cultural practice of geisha. And for 100 years almost, the international community was limited to only focusing upon the transnationality of the movement of the enslaved person, nothing within national borders. So the Palermo Protocol brings the obligation, the international obligation, into a country's borders and says you have to make sure that people are not being enslaved in prostitution, in domestic service, in agriculture, etc., within your own country. It doesn't matter whether they move 1,000 miles, 1 mile, or not at all. So the Palermo Protocol is a wonderful thing, perhaps, except for one thing. And this is very much the original sin of the modern trafficking movement. And we didn't even get an apple for it. And that is, we call it trafficking. Think about that. What does trafficking sound like? Trafficking sounds like movement. Doesn't sound like slavery. Trafficking sounds like the very thing that Palermo needed to fix, which was that old fixation on transnationality. Trafficking, especially in Spanish and Italian and French and Romanian, and I guess probably Latin, because that's where they all come from, doesn't even mean trafficking. Tráfico de personas in Spanish means alien smuggling. So the original sin of the Palermo Protocol, the trafficking protocol, is that it is a trafficking protocol and not a slavery protocol. Now, it's on my business card. When I was sworn in as ambassador, they said I was the trafficking ambassador, so I can't really give that back. And yet, I think we have to really interrogate this question. This term needs to be questioned. Now, the US government uses this term trafficking in persons as an umbrella term for all of the conduct involved in obtaining a person for or maintaining them in a condition of compelled service, whether for sex or labor, whether they are male, female, adult, or child, whether they're a foreign national or a citizen of their own country, whether they've moved or not moved. Now, as my boss, who I think is someone who I hope her name comes up a lot in a speaker series on women in foreign policy, as Hillary Clinton would say, let's just call this what it is. It's modern slavery, pure and simple. Trafficking persons in many ways is just the latest euphemism for something that cultures and countries have been trying to euphemize for a long, long time. Now, when it was at its worst, when we're talking about legal, multi-generational, chattel slavery of the African American community in the United States, the idea of saying the word slavery in public, even though an entire social system, an entire legal system depended upon it, was so repugnant that any euphemism that could be grabbed was. And so, in Frederick Douglass's time, though what he escaped from was slavery, the way that people wanted to talk about it was the peculiar institution. He wasn't a former slave, he had been a servant. This notion of the euphemisms to make ourselves feel a little bit better because we don't have to confront the fact of slavery, the fact of the human rights violation, the fact of the crime. And this is a crime, first and foremost. This is a human rights issue, this is a development issue, this is a women's issue, this is all of those things, but at its heart, this is a crime with a victim and a criminal. In the United States, the 13th Amendment, as I said, guarantees our freedom from involuntary servitude and slavery. And it is enforced by the criminal prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division. You know, Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the international context, Article 4 basically mirrors the 13th Amendment almost verbatim. And I think that some of that reflects the case law that was coming out of the Nuremberg courts as the Universal Declaration was being worked on. This notion of the right to be free from slavery, when that right is violated, it's the government's responsibility to punish those who would violate that right. It's not for the victim. It's not for the survivor to insist upon their rights in court, although they could and they should be able to. It's not for civil society to deal with, although they can and should call the attention to this. At the end of the day, only the government can arrest someone. Only the government can incarcerate the trafficker. Only the government can provide legal status to their victims. The victims are so often vulnerable because of their immigration status. Not always, though. They may be vulnerable because they're a member of a oppressed ethnic or racial minority, or language minority, or religious minority. They may be vulnerable because they're from a group that is not allowed citizenship in the country in which their families have lived for generations. It may be that they're vulnerable because of a mental illness, a physical disability. It's often that they're vulnerable because they're a woman or a girl. But one of the biggest vulnerabilities continues to be the lack of immigration status. And only government can remedy that lack of status. So this is, I think, why it's so important to emphasize, again, that this is a crime problem and that governments have a primary responsibility. In many other human rights areas, we tend to think that the response is sunlight, that the response is the right HRW report, the right amnesty campaign, the right intervention at the Human Rights Council. And again, all of these are important. But at the end of the day, someone who denies another person their freedom should lose theirs. If you enslave someone, you should go to jail. Now, we look at this each year in the Trafficking in Persons report that the State Department issues. And this is a good place to start to see what governments are actually doing to fulfill that promise, the promise of freedom. It assesses nearly every government in the world, and in the last couple of years has started to include the United States in that assessment. What we're looking for is this 3P paradigm that I mentioned earlier. What we're looking for is a victim-centered approach. It ensures that all actions taken to combat this crime focus on the people who have been exploited. Now, this is something that folks who were involved in the domestic violence movement of the 1970s, 1980s, and when I say domestic violence movement, I mean the fight against domestic violence, the fight against sexual violence. Those struggles taught us basic things about putting the victim central to the court processes, central to the police processes. Just as they are moving from victim to survivor, not having the clumsy direct examination or the offensive cross-examination put them back into a tailspin, re-victimize them. And so that requires trained judges, trained lawyers, trained police officers, victim witness coordinators, often counselors within the police forces. And this doesn't mean that the domestic violence movement or the sexual violence movement has triumphed and that those are not problems. But what it means is that we have a baseline of 30 or 40 years to figure out what works. And how can we incorporate these gains of the women's movement into this new approach to this old evil? Now, sometimes my office and I and others in the trafficking movement are criticized for using the term victim, because some interpret it as somehow infantilizing those who suffer this crime. That somehow it is saying that the person who's been abused or exploited by the trafficker is somehow helpless or pitiful, or lacks agency, or somehow is just awaiting passively for a rescuer to come and get them out of their situation. That's not what victim in this context means. As we said earlier, trafficking victims, that's a crime. This is a crime with victims and perpetrators. And we hope that victims become survivors. We demand that countries move victims towards being survivors, empowered, able to see their abusers brought to justice, and able to put this behind them. Some survivors may want to become advocates. Many survivors want to simply go back into the anonymity that was taken from them by the trafficker and by the legal system. But at the end of the day, what we're hoping to do is to give them the power to decide, the very power that was taken away by those who would hold them in slavery. But I think that this debate about how we look at victims and survivors should be the thing that illuminates our way forward, because we talk about this victim-centered approach because this is not a crime that's happening to statistics. This is a crime that's happening to people. It's happening to people who wanted better lives for themselves or their families. They wanted maybe even love and respect. They were willing to chance it to get an education for their little sister, medical care for their grandmother, a new roof for their parents' house, or simply were responding to a man who said, I care about you, I love you, only to turn around and say, now you need to do this for me. Because the traffickers are derailing the lives that the victims are seeking. And the victims are not powerless. In fact, they are often the most motivated. I don't know if it's a diplomatic term or not, but the spunkiest. We often hear from governments in destination countries that say, you know, these trafficking victims are really hard witnesses to work for because they're so demanding. They don't just do what we tell them to. They want things. Well, think about a young woman who leaves her village in northeastern Ukraine and makes her way all the way to Seattle, Washington, looking for a better life. She's not helpless. She's certainly not the kind of girl that's just going to sit back and accept her lot. Now, what I find more endearing about the trafficking victims, and sometimes how empowered they can be, and how they're willing to grab that themselves, and how they express that spunkiness, is in my previous life as a prosecutor, when I would talk to the traffickers. And of course, anytime you're trying to derail a trafficking ring, anytime you're trying to undo an organized crime network, one of the things that you're looking for is who is that trafficker in that group that you're going to be able to, colloquially, we'd always say flip, turn against their fellow traffickers. And one of the things that I always looked for was the guy who almost seemed relieved that he didn't have to deal with this anymore. One of the reasons why it often becomes so violent is because the traffickers don't know how to control the people who they are enslaving. Because the people who they are enslaving are fighting back through whatever means they have. And that can be that they're hiding a little bit of money on their own. That can mean that they're talking to customers. That can mean that they're trying to figure out how to get out. Traffickers do not rest well at night, and it's not because they have guilty consciences. It's because they know that they have people who they are holding as slaves who are just as smart as they are, who are going to try to leave. And so the notion, if I could find that trafficker who was tired, who was frustrated, who didn't know how he was going to keep these women under his control, and offer him a way out of that. Now, it was a way out that required him to go to jail. But there's almost a palpable sense of relief on some of these guys because it's tough work. And I'm not trying to excuse them. But I think that's at odds with what we sometimes think of when we're thinking about the trafficking victim. As someone who's sitting, like in an episode of CSI Miami a few years ago, someone who's sitting patiently inside of a shipping container, waiting for the brave detective to open the container and let the light shine in and free them. Trafficking victims are fighting for themselves. And they need to be able to fight for themselves. And we need to recognize that and give them voice. Now, this has been the case forever. And we're lucky enough that sometimes we can actually hear those voices and we can remember those voices. And I want to bring one of those voices back from a forgotten history. Thankfully, the National Archives has kept at least one such strong-willed survivor's voice for us throughout the years. And that's the voice of Spotswood Rice. Spotswood Rice escaped, made it to the Union lines, signed up, and when he wrote in September of 1864 to the woman who owned his wife and daughter, what he was saying is, I'm coming back. I want you to understand that Mary is my child and she is a God-given right of my own. And you may hold on to her as long as you can. But I want you to remember this one thing, that the longer you keep my child from me, the longer you will have to burn in hell, and the quicker you will get there. For we are now making up about 1,000 black troops to come up there. We think, however, that we have children in the hands of you devils. I want you to understand, Kitty Diggs, that wherever you and I meet, we are enemies to one another. I offered you once to pay $40 for my own child, but now I am glad you did not accept it. You call my children your property. Not so with me. My children is my own, and I expect to get them, and when I get ready to come after Mary, I will have a power and authority to bring her away and exact vengeance on them that holds my child. I want you now to just hold on to her if you want to. If your conscience tells you that's the road to go, go that road, and what it will bring you, Kitty Diggs. I have no fear about getting Mary out of your hands. This whole government gives me cheer, and you cannot help yourself. That girl, Mary, was interviewed in 1937 by folks from the Writers Project of the WPA. And in her interview, Mary Bell, by then in her 80s, said, I love an army man. My father was an army man, my husband, my son. I love anyone who will fight for what's right. I would suggest that despite our misconceptions, despite what we often think about trafficking victims as someone who needs to be rescued, as the women who wait patiently in the locked shipping container for a man with a gun to open and let them out and to bring them freedom, that most trafficking victims today have more in common with Spotswood Rice. They know something wrong has been done to them. What they don't have is 1,000 others marching with them to go back for those who are left. And we have to be those others. Governments have to give them cheer as they fight for the freedom of themselves and their families. And I think that very much means restoring to them what their traffickers denied them: freedom, voice, agency. I think it's appropriate to talk about this in the context of a speaker series on women in foreign policy, because if there is anything that we have fought for in the women's movement over the last 30 years, it is the notion that powerless voices must be heard. Powerless voices must be incorporated into the solutions. And when they are, new solutions come up that have never been thought of. I don't just think about that young girl, Mary, wondering if her father was coming for her. And then 60 years later, knowing that you have to fight for what's right. I think about other young women like Shemaiah Hall. For years, the only America that she knew was the California garage, where her traffickers made her sleep after they brought her from Egypt at the age of 9 to be their domestic servant. They went to jail. She's going to college, and she wants to be a federal agent so that she can free those who are still in bondage like she was. One of her strongest memories, which she'll take to her grave, was the way she was treated with respect by those federal agents. A couple of months ago, Shemaiah Hall walked into another courthouse, not where she testified against her traffickers, but she walked into another courthouse, and again she raised her right hand. And this time, she walked out as an American citizen, because our trafficking laws allow people to stay in the United States and achieve their dreams. She had the opportunity, and now she's living the life that the traffickers had stolen from her. I think of young women like Brittany, who I met a couple weeks ago in Iowa. She ran away from home when she was 15, and she was scooped up almost immediately by an exploitative pimp who saw her in a grocery store and walked up to her and asked, "Have you ever thought of being a model?" 3 months later, she was freed from a hotel in Chicago by an undercover officer who recognized that she was a child, not a criminal. And last week, she stood next to the governor of Iowa as he signed laws that will help the folks who are suffering what she survived. Now, these two young women, I think of them here on campus because now they are both college students dedicated to fight against human trafficking, just like some of you. And these are two young women who you would not blink at all if you saw them walking on campus today. And yet, we need to figure out how to let their voices be heard, how to incorporate them into policymaking as we work to meet another challenge. Not simply the promise and the challenge of freedom, but the challenge, nothing about them without them. Incorporating new voices, incorporating women's voices, especially incorporating girls' voices. So how does this fit into the much larger framework of foreign policy, which is so often designed to be able to have conversations that strip away the emotion, that strip away the individual suffering, so that solutions can be found in the policy sphere? Well, to begin with, trafficking in persons is a women's issue. It's a crime. We've talked about that. It's a lot of other things. It's a human rights issue: immigration, labor, agriculture, food security, health, development. You name it, it shows up. Human trafficking disproportionately affects women and girls. But that disproportion is not 90%. It's not 100%, as many people think of when they call this trafficking in women and children. Women and girls make up about 56% of the trafficking victims in the world. And yet, policymakers, when they think of trafficking in persons, they think of trafficking in women, maybe trafficking in children. Regardless of whether someone is a woman or a man, a girl or a boy, traffickers seek out the most vulnerable segments of our population. And as long as women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable, they will continue to be disproportionately affected by human trafficking. Whether they're migrants, or people who don't have the same rights or status in their societies, or they're desperate for a better way to care for their family or their children, they will be prey for the traffickers. And unfortunately, some of them will also be traffickers themselves. Too often do we see women committing this crime against other women and girls. There's been a false dichotomy at times in the discourse. Sex trafficking is a women's problem. Labor trafficking is a men's problem. But for the fact that in many countries, women make up certainly the majority of the farmers, but even more so, the majority of the migrants. Indonesia is now 70% female in its outward work-based migration flow. 70% of the people who leave Indonesia for work in other countries are women, and they're not just workers. They're going into perhaps the most dangerous job, the domestic servant, the live-in domestic servant, in countries that haven't internalized the fight against slavery. So this idea that labor trafficking is men, sex trafficking is women, the idea that this is simply an issue of prostitution policy, simply an issue of Eastern European women ending up in Western Europe. In the 12 years since the Palermo Protocol, we've seen countries around the world come to a greater understanding of what we're dealing with and the context in which it operates. Because we know that when women have opportunities, when we invest in women's health and education and employment, where women are full partners in government, or more full partners than they have been, it lifts societies. Working to advance human rights for women isn't just the smart thing to do, it's the right thing to do. Because women represent the enormous untapped potential that, if it was only unlocked, could build prosperity in the world. Modern slavery perverts that and takes a step in the exact opposite direction. Because the traffickers unleash that potential. They say, I'll get you a better job. I'll get you an education. So that girl, that woman, the spunky one, says, I'm going to do that. I want to be all of those things that these inspiring women have led me to believe that I can do. And then trafficking steps in. It devastates communities, it tears countries apart by undercutting the rule of law, creating a fertile breeding ground for corruption. And the best innovations, the strongest partnerships, the largest investments that we use to fight for women's rights will just sit quietly on the launch pad if the population that we're targeting is being deprived of their most basic freedoms. Now, advancing women's rights isn't the only thing that can be derailed by human trafficking. Think of the other issues that we just mentioned. Food security. If fishing boat captains are willing to enslave their crews, as we've seen in reports out of New Zealand, if the operators of the shrimp processing facilities in Thailand are willing to enslave women and children to process the shrimp for export to the United States, how can we possibly think that those fisheries are secure and stable? We know in New Zealand that the enslaved crews were being told to dump the small fish in the middle of the night when the fisheries inspectors went to sleep. And according to the enslaved crews on those boats, the true catch in the New Zealand fishery in the Antarctic is almost twice as much as what's being reported. Environmental degradation, depletion of our fisheries. The Amazon. If traffickers are willing to enslave men and women in the Amazon to clear the forest, turn the wood into charcoal so that they can make pig iron, which they can sell to the car companies, so that we can drive cars in the United States, then how can we have a conversation about deforestation without thinking about trafficking victims? When activists in Europe take to the streets to demand an end to the deforestation of orangutan habitat in Sumatra and Java, and yet fail to talk about the enslaved workers who are cutting down those trees, the enslaved women who are brought in to provide prostitutes to those men, we're missing half the picture when we're talking about environmentalism. We can't make progress on these priorities, these other non-trafficking priorities, until we level the playing field first, until we make sure that the people involved are actually free. Now, there's another part of this that has to do with women and women in foreign policy. And it's about the women who saw the challenge of modern slavery, of human rights, of inequality on a global scale. Last week I was in Seattle at the National Association of Attorneys General trafficking gathering. And a researcher from Ohio presented the findings of a study that she had done, where she looked at all of the states in the United States that had passed anti-trafficking legislation, sometimes more than one piece of legislation over the last 10 years, and cross-referenced it by who was in those legislatures. Now, this is all states that had passed trafficking legislation, but go figure, the ones who only did criminal penalties for traffickers, as opposed to rehabilitative services for trafficking victims, a direct correlation between the number of women in the legislature and what policy response they had to human trafficking. This should surprise no one who's been working in the policy area in the last 20 years. But again, this doesn't just happen to statistics, it happens to people. And policymakers are not simply statistics. Those statistics can tell us about their behavior. Policymakers are also, perhaps first and foremost, people. And so just as I think about those two young women, Shemaiah Hall and Brittany, I think about two other women. About a woman in a coral suit standing behind a podium in Beijing 17 years ago and telling us what we should have already known, that women's rights are human rights. Such a basic concept, but one that shook up long-held notions about where women fit in to society, where women fit into policy making, where women fit into the very structures that the world had set up. It's about a woman in a long pink dress, kept under house arrest for 15 years, because she demanded that a repressive government hear the voices of the Burmese people. And it's about millions of other women whose names we don't know, whose hairstyles or clothing we're not going to talk about, who we don't recognize when we see their picture. But those women who we don't know, whose voices will not be silenced until the people who make the decisions in the rooms of power, realizing that counting out half the world's population, half the world's voices, is untenable. Because those efforts do pay off. Those efforts do come together. In December of last year, when Hillary Clinton and Aung San Suu Kyi sat down around that table in the home where she had been under arrest for so many years, it sent a message to all of those who perhaps 17 years ago simply thought that women's rights or human rights was simply a slogan. For all of those people over the last 20 years who thought that the government in Burma would never loosen its grip and allow Aung San Suu Kyi's voice to be heard. And yesterday, Aung San Suu Kyi took her seat in Parliament. And soon, the United States will name our first ambassador to Burma in 20 years. When Secretary Clinton announced this step last week, one of the factors that she cited behind the United States action was the adoption of new legislation in Burma, liberalizing many of their repressive policies. And one of those laws, a law that we were able to raise with the Burmese, a law that I was able to discuss with Aung San Suu Kyi when I was there last month, or 2 months ago. One of the laws that was passed since Secretary Clinton's visit was a law signed into law 2 weeks ago by Thein Sein, ending the old barbaric practice of state-sanctioned slavery for government projects. No longer in Burma is it legal for municipal government leaders or state governments to enslave their people for road building, pipeline construction, or any other public work. This type of commitment, this kind of patience that we see in the years that go by from the speech in Beijing, from the years suffered behind closed doors in that house, are the kind of patience and courage that it takes to bring around the sort of generational change that I've been talking about on human trafficking. Whether advancing the rights of women around the world in general or fighting slavery in particular, a huge amount of work remains to be done. And I'm hopeful that as a new generation of foreign policy leaders emerges and begins to rise through the ranks, that you will look to those people who started the conversation that we need to be having. That you will understand the prescience that it took to look past outdated systems and structures and see the international community not where it should be, not where it is, but where it should be. And I'm proud to be able to work for one of those incredible women. But I'm also happy that we have an opportunity to let those voices be heard once and for all. And just as I'm optimistic the anti-slavery movement is making change around the world, I'm equally optimistic about the rising generation of young women leaders, of leaders who care about women, regardless if they are one themselves, of all of those who are going to make sure that our foreign policy, just like our victim care, just like our anti-trafficking work, rests on that one core principle: nothing about them without them. Thank you.
We'd like to go ahead and open the floor to some questions.
Okay. A few weeks ago we had the distinct honor of having Somali mom come Skype right here and talk to us. And she had mentioned what you were saying, that the traffickers themselves are not very organized, but the people who want to prosecute are organized. And you had said that there is this fear, there's this fatigue that these traffickers go through. And it just totally shifted a paradigm in my mind just now, what you said, because the victims, they're victims themselves to a degree. It's not right what they do, but they also suffer. They need to eat too. They have families at home, and whatnot. So the victims end up victimizing, and they perpetuate this criminal activity. And I really see this fatigue and fear combo as a window of an opportunity to get into, and I see it as a potential avenue for a big solution. I mean, my mind's just going right now. I haven't thought of anything, but is this something that you all do at the top? Is this something that ground forces work through very heavily? And what can I do from here to approach that avenue and exploit that opening and tear it open? Because it's a whole other way of looking at the entire issue in a very positive way, in my opinion.
I think that one of the things that we're very much seeing, especially as we're trying to lash up more directly with USAID, is the idea that development solutions that are looking to where criminality is occurring, instead of simply going in and arresting people after they've already committed a crime. And that's a little inchoate. And in an area or in a time where we have some severe budget pressures, it's a little risky to be able to tell that to Congress. We're doing this so that these people don't commit crimes. We've done that in narcotics with trying to give people other options other than growing coca. We've done that in the United States with a lot of youth gang interventions. Something as simple as giving them something to do after school instead of going back to houses where their parents are off working. And so I think that it's something that we haven't necessarily been able to pin down exactly what is the way forward to identify who is the offender profile of a trafficker, such that we can then go in with other options for them. But it's certainly something that we're discussing. There's some places in the world where we know there's trafficking happening from, because that's what people have historically done. If you think about Tlaxcala in Mexico, the town of Tenancingo has always been a hotbed of trafficking, because there's just a whole bunch of families there that's what they do for a living. And when you talk to the Mexican police, you realize that they've been doing that for years, taking the girls and women to Mexico City. And now they're bringing them to New Jersey and New York, to Union City, to Southeast Manhattan, over in Brooklyn. But it's not that it's a new trafficking phenomenon, it's simply a new phenomenon to the New York, New Jersey area. And I think that one of the things that we're looking at when we're thinking about Tlaxcala, for instance, is, well, what other things are there that we should be looking at in Tenancingo? We have to scoop up the bad guys. The ones who are actually doing this do need to be punished. But then what are the other things that people in Tenancingo should be doing for a living other than preying on the misery of others? So it's something that we're starting to try to address, but I'd be fibbing if I told you that we had a well thought out way of dealing with this problem.
Thank you very much, first of all. And in the little reading on the exposure I have had towards this issue, and especially also what we experienced here in the last couple of weeks, it became unfortunately also very clear that there are some hefty commercial and financial interests. And I couldn't have agreed more when you brought up the Ukrainian Beispiel as an example. Any EU expert would tell you their entire commercial straits going. And unfortunately, if they are combined with trades in weapons or drugs, they go on the same line on multiple directions. So, my question to your fascinating observation that the trader himself or herself is basically a victim. How does this square? If there are hefty, up to what, $30 billion per year, commercial interests, who then eventually pulls the string? Are we talking about organized crime on a large scale? Anybody who goes down highways from Vermont to the south is aware of the buses which go sometimes there. So what is there the issue, and how could one cut those lines, which then I assume would make it easier to convert the traders?
I think one of the problems that we have, especially around the organized crime, is that the linkages between, I mean, this is why we call it organized crime instead of just crime, is the linkages between organized crime and the licit business community. There's a lot of capillaries that overlap there. And of course, I'm not a medical student, so I'm not sure how the blood gets from one capillary to another, but that's kind of what happens with organized crime and licit businesses. That notion of, the trash hauling that needs to be done out of Milan because of all of the industrial sector there, those are legitimate businesses that need that done, and in that case, the mafia is willing to come in and work with them, and there's a little bit of fuzziness and a little grayness, and
like the concrete industry in New Jersey.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that we see as well with the labor brokers. One of the things that, and I don't know of Princeton having an overseas campus. We might have one, and I don't know about it, but this is one of the things that the students up at NYU really came down hard on NYU when they were building their campus in Abu Dhabi. It's either in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. I can't remember which one. I think it's Abu Dhabi. But they and the Guggenheim Museum were both building these beautiful new facilities, and the students at NYU said, "Wait a second. The guys that are building these are all of these migrant workers from Bangladesh and from India and from South Asia who've paid thousands of dollars to recruiters to be able to get the job, thinking that they'll be able to make enough money to support their family. And yet when they get to the Gulf, their passports get taken, and the bosses remind them that they are in debt already to those recruiters. They basically show up in debt bondage. Well, one wouldn't say that those giant construction companies are criminal enterprises, and yet, because they need someone to bring them the workers, just like the industrialists in Milan are willing to work with the mafia as long as the toxic waste gets taken away in the middle of the night, the same thing then happens with construction companies. I think that we see this in so many areas that the line blurs between licit and illicit. I think about a case that I did a few years ago, and let's take off to the side whether strip clubs are licit businesses or not. They're certainly legal businesses. And I prosecuted a couple of guys who were enslaving up to 6 women, which that's when it started falling apart because they couldn't manage all of them, in strip clubs in the Detroit area. Some of these women were college students in Kiev that thought they were coming to the United States on the summer work and travel program, which is supposed to be an educational exchange where you can see American society, and they suddenly then get put into a strip club in Detroit. Well, the women that they were dancing with, or next to, were American citizens who were not being enslaved in the strip club. Because it wasn't the strip club owner that was enslaving them, it was these guys who were talent agents.
Right.
And they'd bring the women to the strip club in their Mercedes. They dressed like Russian mafia, and the girls thought they were Russian mafia, but of course they were lying. They were Russian, but they were dressing like the mafiosos so that they could scare the girls. But here you had a sexually oriented business that already is kind of on the shadows of society, but legal. And then you had a couple of traffickers who then bring their trafficked victim into that milieu. I think that there's a lot of that fuzziness, and I think unpacking that is very tough.
That all depends on the political will.
It depends on the political will of both the business owner, small p political will, and of the local authorities. Too often, the only place that a police officer is going to see a trafficking victim in most places in the world, including the United States, is a strip club or a brothel. And the police officer is not there to look for a trafficking victim to free. They are customers in the strip club or the brothel. Or they might even own the strip club or the brothel in some places. And so that notion of corruption then just flowing straight into that and undoing the political will. But I tell you, the owner of that strip club that I was talking about, Cheetahs, which suspiciously burnt down during our investigation, the owner of Cheetahs was perfectly happy to have all of these beautiful Eastern European women dancing in his club because it just brought in so many customers. And so he wasn't asking any questions about these thugs, and he wasn't asking any questions as to why the women were working double shifts. All the American women were working 6 hours a day or so, which is exhausting work. The Russian-speaking women were working 12-hour days, and with a desperation that came from the fact that if they weren't meeting their quota, they'd get beaten. And the American who owned that bar, he didn't care because the money was up. Insert the word beauty salon in New Jersey for strip club in Detroit into that story, and you've got the situation from a few years ago with the girls that were braiding hair up towards Newark. The salon owner just knew that there was a bunch of African women who were really good at braiding hair and would work harder than anybody she'd ever seen. Those people, they didn't mind as long as the hair got braided. 2 years. One of the victims told us later that she had decided, she was I think 13 or 14 when they brought her from Togo. She had decided that if one of the customers asked her how she was doing, that she would actually tell the entire story and hopefully get help, because she knew that she could, if somebody asked, that they cared about her. And for 2 years, and you'll have people in the chair for hours? I should ask. You guys have great grades, so it's like, it takes 6 or 7 hours, right? It's 6 or 7 hours every day of braiding, and not over the course of a year, not one customer asked her how she was. And so it's not just that the business owner has kind of an incentive not to ask. Even the customer, as long as the customer is getting the shrimp at the price they want, or the customer is getting their hair braided, they're not asking questions. That girl stays quiet. Trafficking continues. Please.
Ambassador CdeBaca, I've read about the debate within the Bush administration a few years ago as to whether India, which has such a huge problem with this, ought to be downgraded in the TIP report to Tier 3. But I'm not up to date. I know it hasn't happened yet. Another report will come out. But could you just give us a little update on what you see as progress in India, if there be progress, relative to what India should be doing?
Well, it's couple of different things. There's progress compared to where they were, how they then mesh in with the minimum standards that Congress sets forth, and then where they should be and how they could get there. One of the biggest things back, and this was under my predecessors, but my understanding of the debate at the time, I think this was in basically 2007-ish, was that India was officially denying that bonded labor was part of trafficking. India and those who would support it were claiming that the government of India could not do anything at the central government level to address human trafficking because the Indian constitution prohibited having an equivalent of an FBI or something like that because everything is devolved to the states. And so the American insistence that there should be a national coordination function, that there should be a specialized anti-trafficking unit, et cetera, at the national level, that would then drive things out. The stock answer from the Indians and from some in the American foreign policy establishment at the time was, you can't do that because of the Indian Constitution. I only really know what I've been working on with the Indians, and though they can be a frustrating government to deal with at times through the foreign ministry, what we've seen in the last couple of years is a all-hands circular to all of the police forces in the country, the anti-human trafficking units being set up around the country, and then a circular going out saying in its first sentence the forms, what is human trafficking, and it's forced labor, bonded labor, and sex trafficking. So the first time ever we see the government of India recognizing that bonded labor is part of human trafficking, and that was tectonic. The other thing that we see is that these anti-human trafficking units then being out in all of the various regions, but then the creation of a headquarters level anti-human trafficking unit, the very thing that we've been told was unconstitutional. And we knew it wasn't unconstitutional because they'd done it for narcotics. They just didn't want to do it. So what we've seen is real leadership on the part of the Home Minister. And so that's kind of like Janet Napolitano here. And I think that as we've seen the policy center shift in India, perhaps away from the foreign ministry and over into the home ministry, we've seen some real committed actors. And it goes back, I think, to this issue of political will. Yes?
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I had two questions. I think both of them follow on what you've just been talking about. The first question, and both of these, by the way, come from my capacity as I'm a sociologist and a professor of women's studies, so that's where I'm coming from. The first question is methodological. I'm wondering if you could speak more generally about the TIP report and how it's comprised. Came up for me recently. I supervise students who do research on trafficking all over the world. There was the article in the New York Times this weekend about women in Spain coming from Nigeria. And the citation was to the US government, the TIP report, and then you go to that and it just says interviews with media and politicians in Spain. So it's not quite scholarly standards of attribution. And then my student is helpless and can't do much more with it. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that. The second question is definitional, and it's in my capacity as somebody who does pedagogical work around these issues. When I try and explain to students, well, as you were doing, trafficking is, labor, and it's also sexual violence, and how these two things come together. And often I'll get a question, why only sexual violence and prostitution? What about, for example, child sexual abuse in the family? Is that not a form of slavery as well? And of course, there's a rich feminist lineage which would say that it is. So what gets to be called slavery and what doesn't?
Well, let me address the rich feminist lineage, because I often, as I engage on this, I have to get my transcript out and see if Professor McKinnon is retroactively adjusting my grade down. The women who taught me, at least at law school, certainly with Professor McKinnon and the work that she did with Andrew Dworkin and others, I think we're right to be questioning from kind of a conceptual framework, kind of where are the outer edges of slavery. And I think that if you look at, then you graduate from law school and you go out and you start doing the cases, and you're looking at kind of what is it that we understand to be slavery. And as the Kospinski case at the Supreme Court tells us we have to do that, we have to go back to 1865 and look at what the framers were understanding to be slavery. Now, what the framers understood to be slavery was not limited to commercial sexual exploitation, because there's a lot of work, and Neil Keitel at Georgetown did a wonderful piece, I think it was when he was still at Yale in law school, that was in the Michigan prostitution advocacy seminar issue of the Journal of Gender and Law in '93, which is where some of Professor McKinnon's cutting edge work on this also appeared. What Neil found when he went back and looked at the legislative history of the 13th Amendment was that there was a lot of discussion of the widespread and routine sexual abuse that was happening of the women who were enslaved. So the notion that it was not simply that slavery was your day job as a field laborer or a housemaid or a traditional healer or a midwife or any of those other things. It was also the ownership right and the ability of the white men who owned you to then use the woman sexually. And this is certainly what I've seen as a prosecutor and now as a diplomat around the world, is that the number one predictor of whether or not a woman is going to be sexually abused in a trafficking situation is not whether she's in the quote-unquote sex industry, it's whether or not she's a woman. So the knock on the door at night on the domestic servant who's living in the house, well, you know, I've done these cases in the field for long enough to hopefully be able to say something very outrageous from a podium, which is the sex trafficking victim has something that the domestic servant does not. And that is the men that come to have sex with them may be a route to freedom. The strip club case that I was talking about, it was a guy who convinced himself that he was in love with one of the dancers. And she finally, because he was not groping her all the time, she finally confided in him what her situation was. And he ended up getting on the internet and researching human trafficking and said, you know, there's a program, they'll let you stay in the country, you know, come with me down to the immigration. And, you know, he was able to basically be her way out. That's never going to happen to a domestic servant who's being raped by maybe even the boy that she raised. So, you know, I think that this is one of the things that we see is what I've been fighting for and what we've been doing in this administration around sex trafficking is, while on the one hand trying to make sure that we're fighting the sexual abuse that happens within commercial sexual activity, that we're also fighting the widespread sexual abuse that happens in labor trafficking. So whether it's an egg farm, whether it's a domestic servant situation, whether it's the garment factory case that you'd mentioned. You know, that garment factory case, the only way that you could really get off the line and not be having to sew and getting beaten up by the guards down on the factory floor was to become one of the secretaries. And you became one of the secretaries by becoming one of the mistresses of the trafficker. Now that raises a whole lot of other issues then, is at what point is the survivor and the things that she does to survive tip over into being an accomplice? But this is why this is fascinating work, because we're dealing with people. We're not dealing with labels. And so I think that that's, to me, one of the things that I've always tried to do is to take what I learned from Professor McKinnon and others, and then take that out and apply it to the actual victims rather than to my theory or my assumptions about the victims. On the methodology, we do have sources for all of those things that are, and this isn't going to help anybody in the non-diplomatic world, and we debate them healthfully amongst ourselves as we're coming up with the ranking and even the narrative. And then, in order to shield our sources, when it's a source that needs to be shielded. Or otherwise, we end up putting that kind of, researchers indicate, or an international organization indicates. There's an international organization that has a research project going in a place that has a lot of trafficking. In the context of a multi-country effort against trafficking, and one of the countries that has billions of dollars at stake in its fishery is so offended by the truth of the research that's coming out of this project that they are trying to disband the project entirely so that research doesn't come forward. So for us to be able to mask that research a little bit so that they're not automatically saying, we're going to come after you, especially with the non-governmental organizations. We get a lot of our information from the NGO community, and yet if it said in the report, the NGO Tenaga tells us that, folks are put in jail when they run away from their abuser in Malaysia, then we've just put a target on their head for the government of Malaysia if the government of Malaysia wants to retaliate against them, and we can't really do anything. So a lot of what you're seeing where we're not sourcing as clearly as we could be is because of that. But especially if you're talking about, we can't do it for every undergrad that's working on this, but especially if you've got graduate students who are working on this and everything else, please give us a yell, and we can try to help, guide people's research, get them connections in the other places. We use what you do. This is one of the things that I think, perhaps because trafficking is in its latest iteration new enough, we very much hunger for the work that sociologists and anthropologists and victimologists and criminologists and every other ologist that we can think of are doing out in the field, because it gives us more of an insight into what's going on. And so, we can, maybe you guys can give me my information and we can, try to help out that way.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or, yes, please.
So I went on a breakout trip to Atlanta over the spring break, which was investigating child sex trafficking, and we had the opportunity to speak to some law enforcement officials. And you mentioned about how the process of rescuing these girls sometimes tended to criminalize them, and they held very different perspectives considering how to treat the girls, because in their view, incarcerating these girls was a way of holding them away from the pimps, and preventing them from running away, and providing a pathway towards rehabilitation, whereby in the view of some non-governmental organizations who work with these girls, it's more mentally damaging and scarring, and does not give the girls the agency to that they're true victims, and criminalizing them is just a hindrance to what that they could potentially become. So what is your view on that, as to how both law enforcement officials, governments, and people who are working besides the government treat these girls?
This is one of the hardest questions, especially with youth prostitution, when there's been an identification with the trafficker. This isn't a problem with youth prostitution, in many countries where you have brothels where girls are sold when they're tiny, or whatever, but it's very much, I think, something that we see in the United States with the relationship between an underage girl who is in prostitution and a pimp who is wooing her with promises of love and things like that. And, it's very tricky. I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that the guiding principle of work with child victims of crime needs to be just like it is with child victims of parental abuse or neglect. And that is, the first question needs to be what's in the best interest of the child. Children aren't necessarily always the people who can decide that, and so that's why the guardianships ad litem become so important. Somebody who's appointed to basically stand in loco parentis, which is in the place of their parents. What we've seen is that sometimes there will be a runaway attempt to go back to the guy, and when that happens, you almost never get them back, except for when you do. And so one of the things that we've been encouraging the detectives and the social workers and everyone else is to try to be as hands-off as possible. You have to get them into something where they have an adult that's supervising them, whether it's foster care or back with their own parents. But then at the same time, making sure that they know that you're going to be there for them, so that if they do run off and they go back to him for a few months or whatever, when they are ready to leave, they'll come. And there's an amazing juvenile court judge in Las Vegas who treats the young ladies with a lot of respect. And not everybody, but he'll get calls from people who have ran off, violated their terms of release, and everything else, and 4 or 5 months later they'll call him from some other state and say, you're the only person who treated me well in this entire process, I want to come back. And of course then as the judge, he's trying to make sure, that they don't run away again the next time. So it's really tough though, because there are some instances where a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime needs to be held. We do that through the material witness warrant, not just in trafficking, but in other areas as well. And so, I think that as long as people are thinking about the best interest determination, what's in the best interest of the child, that can guide us. I think there will still be tragedies, unfortunately. But I'm glad Atlanta is a great place to go to look at this, because people are really thinking hard about this down there.
Okay, well, I think we are at the end of our time, unfortunately. Thank you, Ambassador, for your lecture and your comments.